Increasingly out of step, the rulers continued their rituals, the officials continued their routines, and the walls continued to keep everyone else out. Until one day, the walls didn't feel as solid anymore. Not because they crumbled, not because invaders stormed the gates, but because the belief holding them together began to thin. People outside started asking uncomfortable questions. Why was the ruler hidden? Why were the gates closed? Why was an entire city off limits when the world was changing so fast? Inside, the response was predictable. More rules, tighter controls, less access. Because when an old system feels threatened, it doesn't open up, it pulls inward. The city became quieter, fewer ceremonies, fewer grand appearances. The ruler retreated further into the inner spaces, surrounded by tradition like a security blanket woven from centuries of habit. And then, almost without announcement, the era ended. The gates didn't dramatically swing open. There was no single moment of revelation, just a gradual realization that the city no longer functioned as intended. The power had moved elsewhere. The rituals felt hollow. The walls protected nothing but memory. And suddenly, the city that no one was allowed to enter became a city no one lived in. Empty halls, silent courtyards, rules with no one left to enforce them. A place designed to be eternal, quietly abandoned by time itself. And that's where we'll pause for now. Let the image settle. Stone pathways untouched. Doors that once required permission now open to dust and echoes. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the lives of the people who lived inside those walls. The rulers who were never alone, yet always isolated. The officials who spent their lives memorizing rules that would one day mean nothing at all. But for now, just rest here, in the quiet of a city that was never meant to be lived in by anyone else. All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little, that's fine. That's encouraged, actually. Just let the story pick you back up wherever you are. We're still inside those walls, still moving slowly. No sudden turns, no loud moments. Just the quiet continuation of a city that was never meant to feel normal, even to the people trapped inside it. Because here's the strange thing about a forbidden city. Once you finally get inside, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels managed. Increasingly out of step, the rulers continued their rituals, the officials continued their routines, and the walls continued to keep everyone else out. Until one day, the walls didn't feel as solid anymore. Not because they crumbled, not because invaders stormed the gates, but because the belief holding them together began to thin. People outside started asking uncomfortable questions. Why was the ruler hidden? Why were the gates closed? Why was an entire city off limits when the world was changing so fast? Inside, the response was predictable. More rules, tighter controls, less access. Because when an old system feels threatened, it doesn't open up, it pulls inward. The city became quieter, fewer ceremonies, fewer grand appearances. The ruler retreated further into the inner spaces, surrounded by tradition like a security blanket woven from centuries of habit. And then, almost without announcement, the era ended. The gates didn't dramatically swing open. There was no single moment of revelation, just a gradual realization that the city no longer functioned as intended. The power had moved elsewhere. The rituals felt hollow. The walls protected nothing but memory. And suddenly, the city that no one was allowed to enter became a city no one lived in. Empty halls, silent courtyards, rules with no one left to enforce them. A place designed to be eternal, quietly abandoned by time itself. And that's where we'll pause for now. Let the image settle. Stone pathways untouched. Doors that once required permission now open to dust and echoes. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the lives of the people who lived inside those walls, the rulers who were never alone, yet always isolated, the officials who spent their lives memorizing rules that would one day mean nothing at all. But for now, just rest here, in the quiet of a city that was never meant to be lived in by anyone else. All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little, that's fine. That's encouraged, actually. Just let the story pick you back up wherever you are. We're still inside those walls, still moving slowly. No sudden turns, no loud moments. Just the quiet continuation of a city that was never meant to feel normal, even to the people trapped inside it. Because here's the strange thing about a forbidden city. Once you finally get inside, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels managed. Life inside the walls ran on schedules so precise they bordered on obsessive. Bells marked time, not just hours, but phases of acceptable activity. When to rise, when to walk, when to wait, when to stop existing visibly and retreat indoors so someone more important could pass through the courtyard without being visually inconvenienced. And everyone knew where they stood, or at least everyone pretended they did. The people who lived here weren't adventurers or mystics. They were administrators, courtiers, servants, specialists in etiquette, professionals at standing still. This was a city powered by people who were very good at doing nothing incorrectly. Take the officials, for example. These were men who had spent their entire lives studying for the privilege of being stressed quietly behind beautifully painted doors. They memorized classics, practiced calligraphy, learned the correct angle to bow at depending on who was standing 5 steps behind them. And once inside the city, their reward was constant anxiety. Because status here was invisible but absolute. You could outrank someone by one ceremonial detail and never speak of it out loud. You could be superior simply because you were allowed to walk on a certain side of a pathway, or because your hat had one extra symbolic flourish stitched into it by a person whose job it was to stitch symbolic flourishes. And yes, there were people whose entire careers revolved around hats. Servants lived a different kind of life, a quieter one. They rose before dawn, moved like shadows, and learned the geography of the city better than anyone else. Not the ceremonial geography, the real one. The back corridors, the narrow passages, the doors that didn't exist on official maps. They knew which floors creaked, which courtyards echoed, which rooms were avoided not because they were forbidden, but because something awkward had happened there once, and no one wanted to talk about it. Because awkwardness in this city was more dangerous than crime. Now let's talk about the ruler again, the living center of the universe. The person this entire architectural fever dream revolved around. From the outside, his life looked impossibly luxurious. Endless halls, lavish objects, servants ready to anticipate needs before he even knew he had them. But inside, it was suffocating. He couldn't leave, not really. Every step outside the inner sanctum required planning, approval, and rehearsal. Even casual movement was ceremonial. He didn't stroll, he processed. His meals were rituals. His clothing was symbolism layered on symbolism. His facial expressions were analyzed by people whose job it was to notice things and report them upward in the most careful language possible. His expression appeared contemplative today, which could mean anything, or nothing, or everything. And despite being surrounded by people at all times, the ruler was deeply alone. Conversations were filtered. Advice was cautious. No one wanted to be the person who said the wrong thing at the wrong moment and became a cautionary tale whispered in corridors for the next 50 years. The family didn't help much either. Royal children were raised with the same distance as everything else. They lived nearby, but not close. They were educated in isolation, taught obedience before curiosity, tradition before identity. Love was implied, not expressed, because affection was informal, and informality was dangerous. Spouses were chosen through calculations so dense they barely resembled romance.
Political alliances, bloodlines, symbolic harmony. Emotional compatibility was, at best, a pleasant coincidence. And when things went wrong in these relationships, which they often did, they went wrong quietly. No shouting, no scandals, just silent separations disguised as protocol. She has been relocated to another residence for reasons of health. Everyone understood what that meant. No one asked questions. The city was full of people who understood things without discussing them. Now, let's float over to another quiet disaster, the issue of boredom. Because when everything is ritualized, nothing is spontaneous. And when nothing is spontaneous, time stretches. Days blur together. Weeks become indistinguishable. Even celebrations felt repetitive. The same ceremonies, the same phrases, the same gestures repeated year after year, generation after generation. Innovation was not rewarded. It was suspicious. If you suggested a new way of doing something, the immediate question was not, "Is this better?" It was, "Why wasn't the old way good enough?" And that question could end your career. So people adapted. They focused inward. They obsessed over details. They competed subtly. A slightly better poem.
A slightly better poem. A slightly more elegant brushstroke. A slightly more perfect adherence to rules that no one fully understood, but everyone pretended were obvious. And yet, despite all this control, human nature leaked through. There were rivalries, quiet ones, passive-aggressive ones, officials who smiled politely while sabotaging each other through paperwork, servants who passed along information with strategic timing, families who aligned themselves carefully, hoping their proximity to power would last another generation, because nothing in this city was permanent except for the illusion that it was. Outside the walls, rumors grew. The city was mysterious, forbidden. People imagined endless wealth, secret knowledge, unimaginable luxury. And in a way, they were right. But they missed the other half of the picture, the claustrophobia, the surveillance, the pressure of living inside a symbol rather than a place. Inside, people rarely spoke about the outside world. It was considered irrelevant or dangerous or both. News filtered in slowly, softened by layers of interpretation. Anything that challenged the city's worldview was reframed as temporary chaos, unfortunate events beyond the borders, as if the borders were protecting reality itself. But time has a way of ignoring walls. Gradually, the people inside noticed small changes, fewer resources arriving, fewer visitors requesting permission to approach the gates, fewer reasons for the elaborate ceremonies that once made sense when the city was truly the center of power. The rituals continued, of course. They always do, even when their purpose has evaporated. The ruler aged, new rulers replaced old ones. Each inherited the same city, the same expectations, the same isolation. And each quietly wondered, in moments they never shared with anyone, whether this was really how things had to be. Some tried to reform, carefully, subtly. A small rule was relaxed here, a minor protocol adjustment was made there, but reform was slow and resistance was strong. Tradition defended itself fiercely, not with violence, but with disapproval. And disapproval in this city was devastating. Eventually, the city reached a strange point. It still existed physically. The walls still stood, the gates were still guarded, but the belief that made it untouchable was fading. People outside stopped being impressed. They stopped whispering. They started walking past. And inside, the realization crept in quietly. The world no longer revolved around this place. The universe had found a new center. The city didn't collapse. It didn't burn. It simply emptied. Officials left first, reassigned, retired, forgotten. Servants followed, some by choice, some because there was no longer anyone left to serve. The ruler, or what remained of the institution, withdrew entirely. And one day, without ceremony,
The city became still. A place once defined by control, now defined by absence. In the next part, we'll drift through those empty spaces, the rooms that once held power now hold dust, the objects left behind, the traces of lives lived carefully, quietly, and mostly out of sight. For now, just stay here. Let the silence settle again. You're doing great. Just keep listening. All right, still here, still slow. If your thoughts wandered off for a bit, that's perfectly fine. This city is very good at fading into the background. Now we're moving through it after it has stopped performing, after the routines ended, after the people quietly slipped away and no one bothered to announce it, because abandonment in this place was never dramatic. The first thing you would notice inside an empty, forbidden city is how normal it suddenly feels. Not lively, not welcoming, just neutral. Without guards constantly redirecting your steps, the courtyards feel larger. Without ceremony, the halls lose their weight. Architecture that once intimidated now just exists. Rooms that were once restricted by rank and ritual open into one another like a series of thoughts that no one bothered to finish. The silence is different too, not enforced, not strategic, just silence. The buildings remain immaculate for a while. That's the strange thing. Places built on ritual age slowly at first. The floors are still polished, the paint hasn't peeled yet. The doors still open with soft resistance, as if expecting someone important to return at any moment. And for a long time, nothing happens. No one comes back. Inside the inner quarters, personal objects remain exactly where they were left. Writing desks with unfinished notes, decorative screens positioned for privacy that no longer matter, chairs arranged for conversations that will never resume. The ruler's living space is the most revealing, not because it's lavish, but because it's oddly restrained. Simple furniture, muted colors, a room designed not for comfort, but for symbolism. Even at the height of power, excess was discouraged, not for moral reasons, because excess implies individuality, and individuality was never the goal. Beds are narrow, windows are screened, everything faces inward. The ruler lived like someone permanently on display, even when no one was watching. And now, finally, no one is. As the city empties, something else happens. Stories start to leak out, not officially, not in the records, but in recollections, in quiet admissions from people who once served inside and now live ordinary lives beyond the walls. They talk about the loneliness, about the constant tension, about how exhausting it was to remember which version of themselves was acceptable in which courtyard. They mention rulers who were gentle but indecisive. Others were cruel out of sheer boredom. Some who tried desperately to connect with the world beyond the gates, only to be reminded that curiosity was unbecoming. And then there were those who simply stopped caring. Those rulers withdrew into routine entirely, letting advisors decide everything, letting ceremonies run on autopilot, existing as a symbol rather than a person, because sometimes it's easier to become a statue than to admit you're trapped. Meanwhile, the city itself begins to change in small ways. Dust settles, birds move in, plants push through cracks in stone paths that once were swept obsessively clean. The careful balance between nature and control dissolves, not violently, gently. Water features clog, paint fades, the symmetry starts to slip, and no one rushes to fix it. Outside, people begin to approach the gates with curiosity instead of fear. At first, they hesitate. Old habits die slowly. Generations were raised knowing this place was forbidden, sacred, dangerous. But curiosity has a way of overriding tradition once the consequences disappear. Eventually, the gates open, not ceremonially, just practically. Someone realizes there's no reason to keep them closed anymore, and the city becomes something else, a relic.
Visitors walk through spaces once reserved for a handful of elites. They stand in halls where silence used to be mandatory and speak in normal voices. They touch walls that were once untouchable. They wander freely, without escorts, without permission, and nothing happens. No divine punishment, no cosmic imbalance. The universe continues exactly as it always has, which is, in its own way, devastating, because it confirms what some inside the city always suspected but could never say out loud. The walls were never holding reality together. They were holding people in. As time passes, the city's identity shifts again.
Becomes preserved, studied, labeled. Historians debate its meaning. Guides recite simplified versions of its history. Visitors admire the craftsmanship and miss the emotional cost entirely. They marvel at the scale, the order, the discipline. They don't feel the weight. They don't hear the whispered rules, the constant self-censorship, the fear of stepping incorrectly. And maybe that's fine, because places like this aren't meant to be understood emotionally by people who never lived inside them. They're meant to be observed, interpreted, quietly absorbed. The city no longer controls access, but it still controls perception. It stands as a monument to the idea that power can isolate itself so completely that it forgets how to function without walls, that a system built to preserve perfection can become too rigid to survive reality. And so the lost city remains, not lost because it vanished, but lost because it outlived the belief that created it. In the next part, we'll slow down even further. We'll drift into the smaller, stranger details, the habits, the superstitions, the quiet emotional breakdowns that never made it into official records. But for now, stay here. Let the city rest. Let your thoughts wander. There's no rush. Let's keep drifting. No sharp turns, no surprises. Just easing deeper into the strange details that made life inside this city feel so carefully managed that it eventually forgot how to breathe. Because the real story of a forbidden city isn't in its walls, it's in its rules, the tiny ones, the ones that sound harmless, the ones that, stacked together over decades, slowly grind people down into something polite, efficient, and profoundly tired. Inside the city, rules governed everything, but not always for obvious reasons. Some rules were practical. Don't run in ceremonial spaces. Don't enter restricted courtyards. Don't touch objects that symbolize authority unless it is your job to touch them. Others were less clear. For example, there were rules about direction. Certain paths could only be walked east to west, others north to south. Turning around in the wrong place wasn't forbidden exactly, but it was frowned upon, and being frowned upon here was like being quietly erased. There were rules about timing. You could pass through a gate at the 7th bell, but not the 6th. You could speak to a superior before noon, but not after. You could submit a petition on one day of the week, but only if the weather matched expectations. No one could ever quite explain why. They just knew it mattered. Color mattered too, not fashionably, symbolically. Wearing the wrong shade on the wrong occasion suggested ignorance at best and disrespect at worst. People memorized color charts the way others memorized faces. And then there were rules about silence. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was strategic. Speaking too much implied confidence. Confidence implied ambition. Ambition implied threat. So people learned to speak just enough to fulfill their role and no more. Conversations became layered with implication. A sentence could mean 3 things depending on who said it and who overheard it. Silence, meanwhile, could mean agreement,
disapproval, or quiet panic. Everyone learned to read between the lines because the lines themselves were rarely safe. Now let's talk about superstition, because when control is absolute, superstition thrives. Inside the city, certain days were considered unlucky, certain buildings were avoided during specific months, certain rooms were entered only after symbolic gestures had been performed. None of this was officially mandated, it was just understood. People knocked on doorframes, avoided stepping on specific stones, took longer routes to avoid passing under certain arches, because in a place where everything is observed, coincidence feels personal. If something went wrong, people searched for meaning. Had someone violated protocol? Had a ritual been performed incorrectly? Had the ruler frowned slightly more than usual last week? Blame rarely landed on systems, it landed on individuals, quietly, strategically. And that brings us to the emotional side of life here, the part that never made it into official records. Loneliness was common, not dramatic loneliness, not sobbing in the corner loneliness, the dull, persistent kind, the kind that comes from being surrounded by people who never speak honestly. Friendships existed, but they were cautious. You never fully trusted anyone, not because they were malicious, but because the system rewarded reporting, not loyalty. A careless comment could travel faster than you did. Romantic relationships were even more complicated. Privacy was rare, approval was required, discretion was mandatory. Love, when it appeared, had to squeeze itself into narrow gaps between obligations. Many relationships faded quietly, not with arguments, but with distance. People reassigned, duties changed, schedules stopped aligning. No one made a scene, because scenes were embarrassing. Mental health as a concept didn't exist. Stress was considered a sign of dedication. Exhaustion meant you were doing your job properly. Emotional collapse was reframed as a moral failing. People adapted the only way they could. They numbed themselves. Some focused obsessively on their work. Some became rigid traditionalists, defending the system with surprising passion, because admitting it was harmful would mean admitting their entire life had been spent inside a beautifully decorated mistake. Others dissociated. They moved through the city on autopilot, bowed, spoke, waited, slept, repeated. And through it all, the city watched, or at least it felt it did, even when the guards were gone, even when the ruler retreated, even when belief weakened, the habits remained. People who left the city carried their rules with them. They hesitated before speaking. They waited for permission that no longer existed. That's how deep the system went. Eventually, of course, time did what it always does. It softened everything. The rules stopped being enforced. The superstitions lost their edge. The city transitioned fully into a historical space rather than a living one. Visitors walked through and commented on how peaceful it felt. And in a way, they were right, because peace after control feels like silence, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is demanding anything from you anymore. In the next part, we'll drift outward again, toward the people who lived just beyond the walls, the ones who watched the city from the outside and built their own myths about what was happening inside. For now, stay comfortable. Let the details blur a little. There's no test at the end. Just keep listening. All right, still going, still slow. If you're half awake and half dreaming, you're doing this exactly right. Now we're drifting beyond the walls again, not leaving the city behind, just widening the view. Because a forbidden city doesn't exist in isolation. It creates a shadow, and people live in that shadow for generations. Outside the walls, life was louder, less coordinated, more human.
Markets opened whenever people felt like opening them. Children ran without worrying about the angles of bowing. Arguments happened in public. Mistakes were made, corrected, and repeated. Nothing was perfect, but nothing was frozen either. And always in the background, there was the city. You could see the rooftops from certain streets. You could hear ceremonial sounds carried on the wind, bells, drums, carefully timed signals that meant absolutely nothing to you, but clearly meant everything to someone inside. And that mystery filled the gaps. People speculated endlessly about what went on behind the gates. They told stories to make sense of the distance. Some imagined the ruler as godlike. Others imagined him as fragile and hidden away for his own protection. Both ideas coexisted comfortably, because neither could be proven. Parents warned their children not to misbehave, or they'd be noticed. Merchants adjusted their tone when selling goods destined for official use. Even people who would never be allowed inside still shaped their behavior around the idea of the city. That's the thing about power. You don't need to see it to feel it. Entire industries formed around proximity. Tailors specialized in ceremonial clothing that they would never wear. Craftspeople produced objects designed to be admired by people they would never meet. Food was prepared according to standards dictated by tastes no one outside the walls actually shared. And yet, resentment simmered quietly. Taxes flowed inward. Resources disappeared behind the gates. Decisions made in silence affected lives lived loudly. And still, no one was allowed to ask why, at least not out loud. Over time, the stories grew more exaggerated. The city became a symbol of everything distant and unaccountable. When something went wrong, people blamed the hidden rulers. When something went right, they credited their own resilience. The city was both omnipotent and irrelevant, depending on the mood. And then something interesting happened. As the power inside the walls weakened, the fascination outside intensified. People leaned closer, metaphorically speaking. They wondered what was really in there, what secrets had been kept, what had been hidden for so long that no one remembered why it was hidden in the first place. Rumors shifted tone, less awe, more curiosity. Some said the ruler was no longer truly in charge. Others said he had never been. Some claimed the city was already empty, functioning only as a shell to maintain appearances. And for the first time, people outside began to imagine a world where the city was just a city, not sacred, not forbidden, just stone and wood and old decisions. When the gates eventually opened, there was no celebration, no mass rush inward, just cautious steps, a few brave visitors, then more. Then everyone realized nothing terrible would happen if they crossed the threshold. The myth collapsed quietly. People walked through spaces they had been warned about their entire lives and felt underwhelmed, impressed maybe, curious definitely, but not awestruck. Because once mystery fades, reality takes its place. And reality, even when beautiful, is never as powerful as imagination. For those who had lived their entire lives outside the walls, the city's opening was less a revelation and more a confirmation. Confirmation that distance had been the point, not divinity. The city hadn't been protecting the world from chaos, it had been protecting itself from change. In the next part, we'll circle back to the rulers themselves, the final generations, the ones who believed their traditions were draining away and had to decide whether to cling to tradition or quietly let it dissolve. For now, just stay with the rhythm. You don't need to remember every detail. The city doesn't mind if you forget.
And eventually, they made the quietest decision of all. They stopped insisting. Not officially, not publicly. They just allowed things to loosen. Guards were reduced, access widened, restrictions softened. Not announced, just enacted. And nothing terrible happened. The sky didn't fall, the balance didn't break, the world didn't notice, which was, in its own way, the final confirmation. The city had never held everything together, it had only been holding itself apart. In the next part, we'll slow down even more. We'll look at what the city became after belief fully faded, not as a symbol, not as power, but as memory, as a place where people walk through and try to imagine what it felt like to live a life where every step required permission. For now, stay right where you are. Let the story keep you company. All right, still with me? Still floating? Now let's do something very gentle. No big timelines, no rise or fall. Just a single, ordinary day inside the city when it was very much alive and very much closed. Nothing important happens today, and that's the point. The day begins before sunrise. It always does. Somewhere in the outer sections of the city, a bell sounds. Soft, measured. Not meant to wake everyone, just the people who are supposed to wake now. Servants rise quietly. They've done this so many times that their bodies move before their thoughts do. They wash, dress, check their appearance for anything that might suggest individuality, everything neutral, everything acceptable. They move through narrow corridors, careful not to speak, not because talking is forbidden, but because it feels unnecessary this early, and because someone might be listening. In the inner quarters, officials wake later. Their schedules are different. Status determines sleep as much as it determines everything else. They prepare for the day with practiced calm. Robes lay out in advance, accessories checked twice. Today's symbols matter, even if no one fully remembers why. Outside, the city beyond the walls is already awake, but in here, time unfolds deliberately. Breakfast is served, not eaten, served. The distinction matters. The ruler receives his meal in silence. Every dish is placed precisely, every movement rehearsed. He eats because it is time to eat, not because he's hungry. Meanwhile, paperwork begins. Petitions are reviewed. Decisions are made slowly, not because they are complex, but because speed suggests carelessness. Nothing important is rushed. An official stands waiting in a corridor, holding a document. He has stood here before, many times. He knows not to lean, knows where to look, knows how long is too long. Eventually, someone passes. He bows. The document is taken. No words are exchanged. That is a successful interaction. Midday approaches. Courtyards filled with controlled movement. People cross paths without acknowledging each other, not out of hostility, out of protocol. Acknowledgement implies familiarity. Familiarity implies equality. Equality is not encouraged. The ruler appears briefly, a procession, not a walk. People lower their gaze. Some count steps in their head to stay calm. This moment will be discussed later. Was his expression tired, thoughtful, unchanged? Entire interpretations will be built around
Subtle nothingness. And then it's over. The afternoon is quiet. Meetings happen behind screens. Conversations are indirect. Everyone is careful not to say too much or too little. It's a delicate balance learned over years of observation and mild fear. Servants clean spaces that already look clean because visible effort is reassuring. Officials wait for instructions that may never come. Waiting is considered productive here. As evening approaches, the city slows again. Another bell, another transition. The ruler retreats inward. The inner quarters close off. The city exhales slightly. Dinner is another ritual, another solitary meal, another reminder that being at the center doesn't mean being connected. Outside the walls, laughter carries on the wind. Someone inside hears it faintly and pauses, just for a moment, then return to their duties. Night falls. The city dims. Guards take their places, not expecting anything to happen. Nothing ever does. And that's the day. No drama, no conflict, no turning point, just repetition, just structure, just a system functioning exactly as designed. And that's why it couldn't last. In the next part, we'll gently wrap things up, not with an ending, but with a reflection. What this city teaches us about control, isolation,
and the quiet ways systems disappear. For now, stay where you are. Let the ordinary day fade back into silence. All right, this is where we slow down even more, not toward a conclusion exactly, more like a long exhale, because stories like this don't really end, they just stop insisting on being heard. So let's talk, gently, about what the closed gates were actually doing all that time. On the surface, the gates existed to protect something sacred, the ruler, the order, the balance of the universe, depending on who you asked and how official they sounded. They were physical barriers, sure, stone and wood and metal, but their real function was psychological. They created distance, distance between power and accountability, between decision and consequence, between people who ruled and people who lived with the results. And distance can feel very safe. Inside the gates, uncertainty was controlled. Everything had a place. Everything had a rule. Nothing was allowed to surprise you too much. When the outside world felt chaotic, the city offered predictability, comforting, rigid predictability. For the people inside, the gates justified sacrifice. Loneliness had a purpose. Restriction had meaning. Every limitation could be reframed as necessary, noble, even cosmic. When you believe you're protecting something fragile and important, discomfort becomes easier to tolerate. Even suffering can feel justified. Outside the gates, the distance served a different role. It created a mystery. Mystery discouraged the challenge. If something is unknowable, it's harder to argue with. You can't question what you can't see. The gates turned power into abstraction, and abstraction is powerful. But abstraction has a weakness. It depends entirely on belief. Once people stop believing that what's behind the gates is essential, the gates become just doors, and doors eventually get opened. What's fascinating is how long belief can outlast usefulness. The city continued long after it stopped being effective, long after it stopped adapting, long after it stopped making sense. Because institutions don't die when they fail. They die when people stop emotionally investing in them. The moment officials stopped feeling proud and started feeling tired, the end had already begun. The moment rulers followed rituals out of obligation instead of conviction, the system was hollow. And the gates, once symbols of order, became symbols of avoidance. Avoidance of change, avoidance of vulnerability, avoiding admitting that the world doesn't need to be controlled quite so tightly to keep spinning. That's the quiet tragedy here. The city didn't fall because it was attacked. It didn't collapse because it was hated. It faded because it was no longer needed, and no one knew how to let go gracefully. So it lingered, beautiful, silent, increasingly irrelevant. Today, when people walk through places like this, they talk about beauty and craftsmanship. They take photos. They admire symmetry. They feel calm. And that calm is real. But it's the calm of something that no longer asks anything of you. When the city was alive, it demanded constant attention, constant compliance, constant emotional restraint. It was exhausting in ways no architecture tour can convey. Now it just exists, and that might be its most honest form. A reminder that power loves walls, but life doesn't. Systems built to be perfect often forget how to be flexible, and that sometimes the most controlling places leave behind the quietest ruins. In the next part, we'll take one final slow walk through the city at night, not historically, emotionally, just to sit with what it feels like when something that once defined everything becomes just another place. For now, don't rush. There's no gate to pass through anymore. Just keep listening. All right, last stretch. Not an ending, really, just a gentle wandering. Imagine it's late. The kind of late where the world feels paused, not asleep. You're walking through the city now, but not as a visitor with a map, just as someone passing through quietly, with no one watching and no rules left to remember. The stone underfoot is cool. It holds the day's temperature the way it always has. Some things don't change just because belief does. The courtyards are wide and empty. At night they feel softer, less imposing. During the city's height, these spaces demanded precision: where to stand, where not to stand, when to cross, when to wait. Now they're just open. You can walk diagonally if you want. No one stops you. The buildings loom, but without intention. Doors sit slightly ajar. Windows reflect moonlight instead of authority. The symmetry is still there, but it no longer feels like it's judging you. This is what happens when control dissolves. What's left is shape, not pressure. You pass through a hall where once people waited in silence, documents clutched in careful hands. You can almost feel the tension that used to live here. Not dramatic tension, not fear, just the steady hum of people trying not to make mistakes. Now it's quiet, not enforced quietly, just the absence of urgency. Somewhere deeper inside, you reach the inner quarters, the rooms that were once untouchable. You step where only a few were ever allowed to step, and it feels anticlimactic. Not disappointing, just human. The rooms are smaller than expected, simpler. They were never meant to impress. They were meant to isolate, to narrow the world down to something manageable for one person at the center of everything. A bed, a desk, a screen, and windows filtered enough to keep the outside vague. This is where the ruler slept, woke up, ate alone, thought alone, carried the weight of tradition without the freedom to escape it. Standing here now, it's hard to imagine anyone envying that life. Power, when stripped of mythology, looks a lot like confinement. You keep walking, past rooms where servants once moved like ghosts, past corridors designed to be unseen. These were the arteries of the city, the places that made everything work while never being acknowledged.
They're narrow, practical, honest. In a strange way, these spaces feel warmer than the grand halls, less performative, more real. You step back outside, the night air feels open. The walls are still there, of course, tall, impressive, but they don't feel close anymore. They don't feel like boundaries, just remnants. And that's when it settles in. This city wasn't lost because no one could find it. It was lost because no one was allowed to experience it honestly. Not the people outside, and not the people trapped within. It existed as an idea longer than it existed as a place. Now it's just stone and memory is softer than law. As you make your way toward the gate, you don't hesitate. There's nothing to hesitate about. No guard, no bell, no ritual marking your exit. You step through, and nothing changes. The world continues exactly as it always has. Messy, uncontrolled, alive. That's the quiet lesson of the lost city no one was allowed to enter. Not that walls are evil or tradition is useless, but that anything built to separate itself from life eventually forgets how to live. And when that happens, it doesn't collapse, it just becomes quiet. So, if you're still awake, that's okay. And if you're not, that's even better. Let the city fade back into silence. There's nowhere else to go tonight. All right, we're still here. You didn't miss anything. There's no secret ending you slept through. The city just keeps existing. And sometimes that's the strangest part. Because once a place like this becomes quiet, the silence starts doing the storytelling for you. At night, the city sounds different from how it ever did before. Not quieter, just less controlled. Wind moves where it wants. Leaves scrape across stone without permission. Somewhere, something creaks,
and no one rushes to interpret it as an omen or a breach of protocol. Back when the city was alive, every sound meant something. A footstep out of rhythm, a door is closing too quickly, a voice raised just half a note too high. Everything was data. Everything was evaluated. Now, sound is just sound. And that freedom, it's unsettling at first. People who visit the city late, after most tourists have gone, often describe the same feeling, a sense that they're intruding. Not because the place is forbidden anymore, but because it still carries the muscle memory of being watched. You catch yourself walking more carefully, speaking more softly, even when you know no one is listening. That's how deeply systems imprint themselves on space. The city doesn't tell you its rules anymore, but your body remembers there used to be rules. Historians sometimes argue about whether this place should be remembered as a prison or a sanctuary, and that debate misses the point. It was neither. It was a compromise, a structure built by people who wanted certainty more than connection, and certainty always comes at a cost. Inside the city, uncertainty was minimized. Life was predictable. Roles were defined. Expectations were clear. But curiosity had nowhere to go. Emotional honesty had no room to breathe. Outside the city, uncertainty was everywhere. Life was chaotic, messy, but it was also flexible, adaptable, alive. The walls didn't just keep people out, they kept unpredictability out. And unpredictability, inconvenient as it is where growth happens. That's why the city eventually stalled. It perfected stillness, and stillness feels safe until the world moves on without you. When modern visitors ask why the city was ever closed in the first place, the answers are often framed in grand terms: spiritual harmony, political stability, cosmic balance. But at the human level, it was simpler than that. The gates were closed because letting people in meant letting things change, and change is uncomfortable. Change the question authority. Change invites comparison. Change reminds you that the way things are is not the way things must be. So the city stayed closed, long past the point where it needed to be. Not because anyone was malicious, but because no one wanted to be responsible for opening it. Responsibility is heavy, especially when tradition is watching. And that's something worth sitting with for a moment. How many systems do we maintain today, not because they work, but because dismantling them feels too disruptive? How many rituals do we repeat out of habit rather than belief? How many walls do we keep standing because no one wants to admit they're no longer necessary? The lost city isn't unique, it's just honest. It shows us what happens when power isolates itself so completely that it forgets the people it was meant to serve, when leadership becomes performance, when control replaces trust. It also shows restraint, discipline, craft, a genuine desire, at least at the beginning, to create order in a chaotic world. That's why it's still compelling. It's not a villain, it's a mirror. As you stand in the city now, in this quiet after-hours version of it, there's no moral being announced, no lesson engraved on the gate, just space. Space where rules used to be. Space where meaning used to be enforced instead of discovered. And in that space, you're free to think whatever you want, or nothing at all, which for a place like this is the most radical thing of all. In the next part, we won't add new events or new facts. We'll just keep sitting in this calm, letting the city exist as a low, steady presence while your mind drifts wherever it wants to go. No guards, no gates, just one more slow walk. All right, this is the part where nothing new happens, and that's intentional. So if you're waiting for a twist or a reveal or a final dramatic sentence that ties everything together, you can stop waiting. This city doesn't do that. It never did. We're just going to sit with it a little longer. Imagine the city just before dawn, that quiet blue-gray hour where night hasn't fully let go and morning hasn't decided to arrive yet. The kind of time that doesn't belong to anyone. The The stones look softer then, less authoritative. Shadows stretch in long, uneven shapes that would have been unacceptable back when symmetry mattered. No one corrects them now. There was a time when this hour was the most controlled part of the day. Guards changing shifts, servants moving quickly but silently. Officials woke with a sense of purpose they didn't question, every minute accounted for. Now the hour just passes. Birds land wherever they want, not where they're supposed to. Wind moves through corridors that were designed to channel people, not air. Somewhere a loose shutter taps gently against stone, and no one rushes to fix it. Back when the city was alive, that sound would have meant something, a disturbance, a flaw, a task to be assigned. Now it's just sound. If you walk slowly, you can almost feel the layers of time stacked on top of each other. The early ambition, the peak confidence, the long plateau, the quiet doubt, the slow letting go. All of it happened here, in these same spaces, with the same walls watching silently, absorbing everything without comment. People often ask what finally ended the city's importance, as if it—
There was a moment, a decision, a failure that could be pointed to and labeled. But the truth is more boring than that. Nothing ended it. It just stopped being fed. Belief faded. Attention shifted. Energy went elsewhere. And without those things, even the most carefully constructed system loses its shape. The city didn't resist, it didn't protest, it didn't try to reinvent itself in a desperate burst of relevance. It simply stayed, and in staying, it changed. What was once rigid became passive. What was once exclusive became accessible. What was once sacred became historical. And that transition didn't damage the city. If anything, it softened it, made it easier to exist within, easier to breathe. That's something worth noticing. Not everything needs to be preserved exactly as it was to be respected. Sometimes letting something loosen is the kindest way to keep it alive. The people who lived here at its height probably wouldn't recognize it now, not just because of the openness, but because of the absence of pressure, the lack of expectation. They lived every day under the weight of meaning. Now the city carries none of that, and that's why it feels peaceful. Not because it was always meant to be peaceful, but because it's finally allowed to be. So as we slowly step away, there's no closing ceremony, no final bow, no symbolic locking or unlocking of gates. We don't need to mark the ending. The city has already done that for us by becoming quiet enough that we can leave without noticing. If you're still awake, you can carry this image with you, the idea of a place that once demanded everything and now asks for nothing. And if you're not awake, that's perfectly fine too. The city doesn't mind either way. All right, we're still moving, but barely now. This is the part where the story thins out, like fog near morning. Nothing is being pushed forward. We're just letting the city exist one last time in your thoughts without asking it to explain itself. There's a strange comfort in places that have stopped trying to matter. During its height, the city was desperate to be important. Every stone aligned with purpose, every rule justified by destiny, every closed gate reinforced the idea that what happened inside was essential to the universe continuing as planned. And now, none of that urgency remains. If you sit on a low step in one of the courtyards, you might notice how uneven the stone feels. It was always uneven. You just weren't allowed to acknowledge it before. Perfection was implied, not examined. The city looks better now, somehow. Not cleaner, not grander, just more honest. There are no ceremonies left to interrupt the day, no one waiting for permission to speak, no subtle panic about whether today's behavior will be remembered as correct or embarrassing. The city has learned how to be background, and that's not an insult. Background is where life actually happens. The people who once lived here didn't have that luxury. Every action mattered because it might be seen. Every mistake carried weight because it could ripple outward through layers of protocol and reputation. Here, now, nothing ripples. A leaf falls.
It stays where it lands. A visitor pauses, then moves on. Time does what it wants. There's something quietly radical about that, because for centuries, this place tried to freeze time, to hold it in position, to tell it when to move and when to wait. And time, patient as ever, simply waited until the city grew tired. It always does. If you think about it long enough, the city's greatest transformation wasn't architectural or political. It was emotional. It stopped demanding belief, and belief is exhausting. Belief requires maintenance, reinforcement, repetition, constant reassurance that what you're doing still makes sense. Without belief, systems crumble. But without belief, people rest. The city chose rest, or maybe it didn't choose at all. Maybe rest simply arrived once no one was strong enough to resist it anymore. Either way, the result is the same. A place that once insisted on silence now offers it freely. A place that once punished deviation now invites wandering. A place that once existed to separate now connects past and present without asking either to change. And that's where we'll leave it. Not because the story is finished, but because it no longer needs narration. The lost city that no one was allowed to enter isn't lost anymore. It's just quiet. And sometimes, quiet is the most complete ending a place like this can have. So if you're awake, you can let your thoughts drift somewhere else now. And if you're asleep, then the city has done exactly what it was supposed to do tonight. Nothing more is required. It's okay if you thought we were done. Places like this have a habit of making you think that. They feel complete long before you actually leave them. So let's stay just a little longer. Not to uncover anything new, not to reinterpret history, just to sit in the after, the time most stories don't bother with, the stretch where nothing is being decided and nothing needs defending. If you're still listening, imagine yourself leaning against one of the outer walls now. The kind of wall that once meant stop, the kind that used to separate importance from irrelevance. From here, it doesn't feel that tall anymore. It's still solid, still impressive, but it no longer tells you what to do. That's the strange thing about walls once they lose authority. They don't disappear, they just become background texture. You can hear the city beyond the walls now, not clearly, just enough to remind you that life never stopped out there. It adapted, it improvised, it kept going without asking permission. Inside the city, life once moved carefully, deliberately, as if every action had to justify its own existence. People didn't rush because rushing implied urgency, and urgency implied instability. Calm was currency. Stillness was proof of control. But control, as it turns out, is a terrible substitute for trust. The people who built this city believed that if they could just regulate enough variables, nothing would ever go wrong. That if every person knew their place and every action had a prescribed form, chaos could be permanently postponed. And for a while it worked. That's the part history often glosses over. Systems like this don't last because they fail immediately. They last because they succeed just long enough to convince everyone they're eternal. The city delivered the order, predictability, continuity. Generations grew up inside it, never knowing anything else, never imagining that a different rhythm of life was possible. And that's where it becomes quietly sad. Because when a system becomes your entire world, questioning it feels less like curiosity and more like betrayal. Even when it hurts you, even when it confines you, even when it leaves you lonely in beautifully decorated rooms, the last people to live here weren't clinging to power. They were clinging to meaning. Meaning is harder to replace than authority. Once the city lost its meaning, it didn't need to be destroyed. It simply stopped asking people to sacrifice themselves for it. And without sacrifice, its grip loosened naturally. Now, standing here, it's easy to romanticize the stillness, to say it feels peaceful. And it does, but it's a different kind of peace than the one promised during the city's height. Back then, peace meant nothing unexpected happened. Now, peace means nothing is required.
You. Those are very different things.
If you listen closely, you might notice how the city no longer demands interpretation. It doesn't care if you understand its symbolism. It doesn't need you to respect it properly. It doesn't punish you for missing the point. It's done teaching. And maybe that's the most generous thing it ever did. So if you feel yourself drifting, let it happen. You don't need to hold on to the details. The city doesn't need witnesses anymore. It's comfortable being just a place you pass through on the way to sleep. And if this is where your night ends, that's fine. If it continues, that's fine too. The gates are open either way. Nothing is keeping you inside. Nothing is asking you to stay. And that, finally, is the end of the story.
Hey guys, tonight get comfortable. Lower the lights a little. Let your phone dim itself into that soft, sleepy glow it does when it knows you're not going anywhere for a while. Maybe you're lying in bed. Maybe you're pretending you're just resting your eyes. Either way, you're exactly where you need to be. Because tonight, we're drifting toward a city that technically existed, but practically didn't. A place built to be admired from a distance and absolutely not entered, ever. So take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's ease into the strange, quiet story of a lost city that no one was allowed to enter. Now, when most people imagine a lost city, they picture jungle vines, crumbling temples, adventurers dramatically brush dirt off a stone face while ominous music plays. This is not that kind of story. This city wasn't lost to nature. It was lost on purpose, locked away by rules, rituals, and an impressive amount of paranoia. A city that sat in plain sight for centuries while most of the world was politely told, no, you're not invited. This was a city of power, of ceremony, of rigid control, and above all else, of people who were absolutely convinced that the walls were the only thing keeping the universe from falling apart. So let's rewind, slowly, no rushing. This city didn't just appear one day behind locked gates. It was built layer by layer, rule by rule, ancestor by ancestor. Long before the city had walls, it had an idea. The idea was simple. The ruler was not just a ruler. He wasn't merely in charge. He wasn't even just chosen by the heavens. He was the center of the universe. Everything else existed around him, including time, space, and common sense. And when you believe that strongly that you are cosmically important, you don't just live anywhere. You don't live near markets or noisy streets. You don't live next to regular people who cough too loudly or ask inconvenient questions. You live apart, separated, elevated, preferably behind multiple walls and several layers of bureaucracy. Over time, that belief hardened into policy. Policy hardened into tradition. Tradition hardened into stone. And eventually, a city emerged that wasn't designed for living so much as it was designed for not being touched. This city became the heart of an empire that ran on ritual. Every movement was scripted. Every interaction was regulated. The ruler didn't just wake up, he emerged. He didn't eat breakfast, he performed nourishment. And the city around him existed solely to support this ongoing performance of cosmic importance. And here's the thing, almost no one was allowed inside. You could live your entire life just outside the walls. You could hear the bells, see the rooftops, watch officials pass in carefully measured processions, and still never step foot through the main gates. Because entry wasn't about curiosity or citizenship, it was about permission, and permission was extremely rare. The city itself was laid out like a physical expression of control. Outer courts for officials who were important but not too important. Inner courts for those who were closer to the center but still very much replaceable. And then, at the very core, the private world of the ruler himself. A place so restricted that even high-ranking elites spent most of their lives hoping they'd never accidentally wander too far. because wandering too far had consequences. The rules were strict, not dramatic, not theatrical, just quietly absolute. You walked where you were told, you spoke when you were invited, you kept your eyes down, always down. Looking directly at the ruler without permission wasn't bold, it wasn't brave, it was a career-ending, life-altering mistake. And of course, these rules weren't written down in a friendly guidebook. They were learned through observation, whispers, and the occasional example made of someone who forgot their place. The city became a kind of architectural hush, a place where sound itself seemed regulated. Doors didn't slam, footsteps didn't echo unless they were supposed to. Even nature felt curated. Trees trimmed into obedience, water flowed exactly where it was told. Outsiders heard stories, of course, they always do. Some said the city was impossibly beautiful. Others said it was suffocating, a golden cage where everyone smiled politely while counting the seconds until they could leave. The truth was quieter than either version. Inside the city, life was repetitive, ritualized, safe in a way. Every day followed patterns that had been set generations earlier by people who were very, very certain they knew best. And no one wanted to be the person who suggested maybe, just maybe, those patterns could be updated, because tradition was sacred, and sacred things do not appreciate feedback. The ruler himself rarely left the intersections. When he did, it was an event. Streets cleared, people lined up, heads bowed, no one breathed too loudly. It was less a public appearance and more a moving shrine. And despite all this reverence, or maybe because of it, the ruler's life was incredibly small. His world consisted of courtyards, halls, and faces that were always careful, always rehearsed. Even family relationships were formal, especially family relationships. Children were raised at a distance. Spouses were selected for politics, not companionship. Emotions were inconvenient. Meltdowns were private, and loneliness was just another part of the job. Outside the walls, life moved on. Markets buzzed. People laughed. Arguments happened. Nothing was perfectly aligned. And yet those people were free to walk wherever they liked. Inside the city, perfection demanded confinement. Generations passed. The city expanded, but only inward. New buildings replaced old ones. Old courtyards were redesigned to better reflect the aesthetic preferences of whoever was currently at the center of the universe. And with each change, the rules grew thicker. What started as spiritual separation became an administrative obsession. Entire departments existed solely to manage who could go where, when, and under what circumstances. A wrong color robe on the wrong day could derail your entire career. And yet people competed fiercely to get inside, because proximity to power, even restricted power, was still power. Officials dreamed of advancement, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of doors passed. Each new door meant fewer people allowed beyond it, fewer rivals, more prestige. Of course, the irony was that the closer you got, the less freedom you had. Those deepest inside the city lived under constant surveillance, not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind where everyone knows everyone is watching, so no one needs to say anything out loud. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the city began to freeze itself in time. Innovation was risky. Change implied that something before had been wrong, and nothing in a sacred city is ever wrong. It's eternal, perfect, untouchable. But the world outside did not agree. Beyond the walls, new ideas circulated, technologies improved, trade expanded, empires rose and fell with increasing speed. Meanwhile, the city behind the gates remained serene, dignified, and eternal.